Hello, everyone. I'm Nate Truax, and you're listening to the Croccast podcast.
Line.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Croccast podcast. I'm your host, Nate, and today I'm joined by Dr. Xander Combrink of Shishwane University, right?
Yeah, it's the Tshwane University of Technology.
All right. So, Xander, mind telling us how you first got into reptiles and your path and research and up to this point?
Yeah, Nate, I mean, I've been the last 20 years or so, I've been involved with Nile crocodiles, research, conservation, management. I've started in 2002 with a master's degree. I've always been interested in reptiles and amphibians, of course, but specifically crocodiles. And here in Southern Africa, we have only really the Nile crocodile. So I got the opportunity in 2002 to study a particular water body called Lake Sabai, which is the largest freshwater lake system in Southern Africa. So I kind of kicked off my interest and my research there. And then from there on, I worked for about 15 years in the scientific services department of the local conservation agency known as Ezomvelo KZN Wildlife. And yeah, there I got a lot more opportunities to be involved in crocodile conservation monitoring, which led to a PhD. And the last 7 years or so, I've been involved in the Tshwane University of Technology, but been very fortunate to still carry on with crocodile work in Southern Africa. So it's been an interesting 20 years from that perspective.
Yeah. So, have you always been interested in crocodilians, or is this something that happened later in life?
Yeah, no, I mean it's from when I was young. I was very fortunate to grow up in a beautiful scenic part of South Africa, the sort of Cape area where there obviously isn't any crocodilians. But yeah, so early on in life, I got really interested, and thankfully it just worked out that I was able to really branch into crocodiles, and been very fortunate in that I've had the opportunity to visit numerous countries, present at a number of crocodile specialist group working meetings in different parts of the world, and also seen other crocodilians in the world. So it's really been interesting.
Yeah. So I've seen in your research you do a fair bit of studying on trace metal and lead exposure in crocodilians. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so that study, we looked at organochlorine pesticides poisoning in Nile crocodiles. And what we did is we found that by sampling fat from live crocodiles, we found that there are really high levels of specifically DDT in Nile crocodiles. That kind of branched off from an earlier study looking at DDT in sediments as well as DDT accumulation in fish. So here in South Africa, there's still malaria. And in that particular part of the KwaZulu-Natal province, there's up until about 15 years ago, there was still some heavily sprayed programs where people were using DDT to combat malaria. So what we found was that there was a gradient of from St. Lucia, Lake Sabai, where I did my master's, all the way up to Cozy Bay. We found that the more north you go, closer to Mozambique, where most of the DDT spraying occurred, there was definitely an increase in DDT levels in the crocodiles. And the levels that we found was some of the highest ever recorded in crocodilians. So it's obviously a big concern because we don't fully understand the effect of the DDT accumulation and the effect on reproductive fitness, and specifically, also the younger cohorts like hatchlings and juveniles. So, yeah, it's a bit of a concern to have these metabolites in live crocodiles, and it's all to do with with just the way that these contaminants bioaccumulate up the food web, because the crocodiles ingest fish. Nile crocodiles do also, of course, they do take larger mammalian prey, but the main prey species within the systems that we've researched is fish. So that's where they get the DDT from. So the fish eat the smaller fish, inverts, sort of aquatic macrophytes, and by ingesting that, it sort of bioaccumulates through the food web, and it ends up in crocodiles being the apex predator in those aquatic systems.
Yeah, as an American, whenever you hear DDT, it's usually attached to something about how its bioaccumulation of bald eagles cause um, problems with the formation of eggshells. I don't know if something like that happened with crocs at all or not.
Yeah, so there's been some studies in terms of, I think most of the studies, in fact, on DDT and crocodilians was exactly that, focused more sort of on the eggs and eggshells, and DDT has got this effect, I think, of a thinning effect of eggshells. And so our study didn't look at eggshells, but there was a study conducted in Kruger National Park, which is also in South Africa, and they did find DDT in eggs, in Nile crocodile eggs. So that needs to be explored a bit more in future, but definitely there is a definite negative effect by having DDT levels in our crocodile eggs.
Yeah. So, do you know what other measures they use in these more malaria-ridden regions other than DDT now?
Sorry, just say again.
Do you know what other measures they use to combat malaria in those regions other than
Right.
DDT now?
Yeah, yeah. So really, they don't. I mean, the only thing that's really changed, Nate, sort of in the last 20 years or so, is just the way that they apply the DDT. So DDT is banned, um, but it is still, or should I say, DDT spraying is banned, but it is still used in households. So in the past, where they would go in airplanes and spray DDT over vast areas and obviously have a very adverse environmental impact, nowadays, specifically in southern Mozambique, but also probably in northeastern KwaZulu-Natal, DDT is applied, at the household. So they would go in and just spray the sort of, the roof, and places where mosquitoes could occur. So it's a lot more selective, and it obviously is a lot better than spraying it from airplanes. So that thankfully have stopped, at least in South Africa. But I think in Mozambique, there's quite likely still areas where they do apply DDT from the air. But yeah, in South Africa, it's applied a lot more selectively. So surely the footprint would be a lot smaller now.
Okay. I saw you also did some research with was lead, high lead exposure. Is that tied in with DDT as well, or is that separate?
Yeah, so kind of the lead story is a bit separate from the DDT, but we also worked in the same areas. We've started with a colleague of mine, Dr. John Warner, who's now heading up the alligator program in Texas, Parks and Wildlife. So John did his PhD with me, and he started by looking at lead accumulation in crocodiles within a number of water bodies in South Africa, mainly on the KwaZulu-Natal side. And that was very sort of disturbing in the sense that the lead levels, and what we did is we sampled lead. We sampled blood from live life free roaming crocodiles, and we found the highest blood lead levels ever recorded, not only in crocodilians but in any vertebrate species. So that was very alarming, and we've followed up with that initial research in 2010 with more studies, and yeah, the same thing every time, having these crocodiles with really high lead levels. And the latest, what we've also found is, not only do these crocs, not only do they live with these very high blood lead levels, but they also show other signs like anemia and tooth loss, which we found in really some of the adult males with very high blood lead levels. So quite an interesting observation was that, it was mainly the males, that carries the high blood lead levels. The females also have high blood lead levels, but significantly less so, than the males. And sort of our hypothesis is that the females do rid themselves of these lead levels by sequestrating the lead within clutches of eggs. So that potentially could be one way for these females to rid themselves from the lead. But we have another study that is going to start later on this year, where we will be looking also at looking into the stomachs of the crocs, because what we found, Nate, was that um, all of the necropsies that we did on crocodiles that died from various causes, they all contained lead sinkers, so fishing weights, as well as what we call drop shots. So that's it's sort of an artificial lure that contains lead and a hook in, and we suspect that the crocs, they pick up these lead fishing weights in the system, as well as actively targeting fishermen's drop shots. And by doing that, they ingest lead, and then this lead obviously elevate within the blood, and then it's sequestrated within the organs, and then finally in the bone. So we're going to carry on with the work on wild crocs, also doing stomach lavages, where we will be pumping stomachs to look at to see if there are any fishing weights and drop shots within the stomachs. Of course, all crocodilians pick up gastroliths, so they pick up stones. But this particular system that we've been working in is on the coast, though there's very little stones. So that's why we think they actively target these fishing weights that's lying on the bottom, and by doing that, they really get these high lead levels. And we're also going to start a experimental study to look really at what is the effect of this lead, because what we've seen, Nate, is that these Nile crocodiles, like numerous other crocodilian species, although they are swimming around with these really high blood lead levels, seemingly they are fine. So they just have this ability, to cope with these incredible high lead levels. But we don't know what the effect is of that in terms of reproduction, in terms of fitness, and health, although we have seen some clinical signs, with anemia and tooth loss within these large adults.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned tooth loss, considering it's still well known that old male crocs and crocodilians tend to lose teeth as they get older. And I've never heard a reason explained why, but it seems like a pretty good reason. But I did have Dr. Marissa Tellez on twice. The second time was she was talking about the crocodilian parasitology. She used to talk about her research. I think it was with American alligators, with stomach nematodes, helping with like the breakdown and metabolization of like heavy metals and stuff that are accidentally ingested. I don't know if
Right.
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know if it's like alligator to crocodile, tomato to apple to orange or whatever. But
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. I mean that could be something that we could also look at. There certainly is. There are ways that they might rid themselves of these lead burdens, but yeah, we have not investigated nematodes. But yeah, so I mean the biology to some extent is the same for all crocodilians, I guess. So that would be an interesting avenue to also investigate with our Nile crocs in South Africa.
Yeah, but also might just be alligators had that one specific species of nematode, possibly.
Yeah.
But yeah, also with the whole lead poisoning, I mean, we're a higher mammal, so we're physiologically quite a bit different than a crocodilian. But the most noticeable thing in humans is like reduced IQ with high levels. It's kind of hard to test that on a wild croc, I guess. But
Yeah, it is. You know, one of the things, Nate, that's been very interesting is also one of the effects of lead poisoning is just lack of movement and coordination. And what we found with some of the crocs that we've tested for lead were also the same individuals that we had satellite transmitters on, and we were able to follow them around. And based on movement and activity, seemingly, you know, they are no different to any of the other study animals that we've had transmitters on. So it is interesting. I mean, certainly with mammals, it seems like we can't cope. Even birds can't cope with the sort of the lead levels that we've seen with these Nile crocodiles. So it is really just it's a mystery how they um, are able to cope with these really very, very high lead levels. But as I've mentioned, we don't know how that actually impacts in other parts of the biology and ecology of the species.
yeah. Speaking of other biology and ecology, you also did research with like nesting behavior and nest site location selection with Nile crocs. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I mean that was also with John Warner. We did our PhDs basically together at St. Lucia, and so we were able to fit a number of satellite transmitters on nesting females. And what we found was that these females, first of all, they have they displayed unbelievable maternal care and behavior, and just the amount of time that they would spend on or near the nest was really amazing, and we were able to quantify that. We had a particular female that basically spent 99.9% of the time within sort of 20 meters of a nest, without going into the hectares and the technical detail. But effectively, like all crocodilians, Nile crocodiles are really good mothers, and they invest, that 3 months of that particular year on the nest. What we found is mostly at night, the females would come onto the nest, and in the day, they would hang around in a water body very close to the nest. Some nests were quite far from the actual lake. So those females would then spend very close to the nesting site under vegetation. I'm talking about a couple of 100 meters from the water. So they would just literally spend the entire day hiding in thick vegetation, and at night they would come up on the nest. And we've also recorded very interesting behavior in terms of predation. So we know that here in St. Lucia, there's two major predators, water monitor and water mongoose. So water monitor is more sort of your diurnal predator, and the mongoose more of a nocturnal predator. But what we found is that the raiding of these nests carried on for up until like 12 days. So even though the female will return to the nest, the monitor lizard will continue raiding that nest when she is physically not at the nest site. So that does have a big impact. And but using camera traps and the satellite telemetry, it gave us a really good insight into the behavior of these females. And also, I mean, we know that females, they reused nest sites. So we were able to, to also document the exact same female coming back to the exact same nest site, for 1 or 2 years. We've put in color-coded cattle tags within the tails of the crocodiles, as well as the satellite transmitters. So, the whole behavior is very interesting, and also that sort of talks to, just what we don't know is, if there's droughts, or like at the moment where there's a lot of fresh water at St. Lucia, how do these females respond to the fact that certain nesting sites might be flooded, or it might be completely devoid of fresh water. So we do know that they will reuse or use new nesting sites as well, but most certainly they definitely come back, if that nesting site is viable, they will come back to the exact same site to nest and to re-nest again later on.
Yeah. And Nile crocs, those are burrowing nesters, right?
Yeah. So they construct a hole in the sand. Yeah, like some other true crocodiles as well. Yeah, so they're not mound nesters like American alligators and a lot of the, all the caimans from South America. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. So maybe not St. Lucia, but South Africa is kind of the southernmost point in the Nile crocs range. So what is the Nile crocs distribution in South Africa?
Yeah, so I mean that's an interesting thing, because the St. Lucia system that I talked about, that's actually the most southern viable breeding system for the species. So historically, Nile crocodiles occurred way down into the Western Cape, and a couple of years ago we described a footprint within a sandstone piece, right down in the Keurboom's River. So historically, they occurred way down, but today, basically from the Tugela River, on the KwaZulu-Natal coast, that's sort of the southernmost point of Nile crocodiles. And then they along the coast as well, there's a couple of protected areas like Shishlubi Umfolozi Park, where we have Nile crocodiles, and all the way up the coast, Cozy Bay, I talked about Lake Sabaya, and then sort of it goes into the Limpopo and Mpumalanga provinces. So the eastern side, really, of South Africa, the northeastern side, and there's quite a few sort of eastern flowing rivers, and although we have seen a decline in almost all populations of Nile crocodiles, we still have representative populations in most of those rivers, all the way up to Kruger National Park, and then also the Limpopo River, which is our most northern river, sharing, with Botswana and Zimbabwe. So sort of the northeastern part of South Africa is the range of the Nile crocodile.
Yeah, so that footprint from the Western Cape, that was, you said, was from the Pleistocene, right?
Yeah. That was about I think 120,000 years ago that footprint was made. So by that time, obviously with climate change, a lot has happened, and the distribution has just shrinked a lot. But also just with human persecution. So like everywhere else since, especially the 1940s, 1950s, there's been a lot of sort of just programs to kill crocs for skins, and also just to try and exterminate them from a lot of water bodies, because of competing with agriculture and fishing, human livelihood. So yeah, unfortunately the story is not that great. And as opposed to countries like like America, where you have the American alligator that came back, and you have really healthy populations, Louisiana, Florida, and a couple of other states. The same with Australia and the northern end. We haven't seen that sort of bounce back, even though since the late 1960s, Nile crocodiles have been protected in South Africa. So also, a lot of our crocodile populations are not within fenced conservation areas. So it's open areas where there's people interacting day to day with water, fishing, and especially in those areas today, there's hardly any crocodiles remaining. So there's been a huge pressure on our crocodiles in South Africa, which is not necessarily the case with countries north of our borders, like in Mozambique and Namibia and Zimbabwe. Going up into East Africa, they still have a lot more crocodiles than we have.
And would that possibly be because they're further into Nile's crocodiles range, whereas South Africa is more on the edge, both environmental and physical edge of where they can live?
Yeah, so we on the edge of the range, so that definitely has got that definitely plays into it. So the more north you go, closer to the tropics, obviously, there's just a lot more habitat available for crocs. While in South Africa we have sort of a very disjunct, populations, and also they're highly fragmented. So maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago, a lot of the rivers, there would have been linkages for crocodiles to move between protected areas. But nowadays, with a lot of water abstraction and water use, a lot of those rivers has gone dry, or it's just not possible. So we're also sitting with sort of highly fragmented populations, and that populations that some of them genetically are already sort of going extinct. So they're very isolated. So that is a big concern from a conservation perspective.
Yeah. So environmentally, on this KwaZulu-Natal, Lake St. Lucia, how seasonal is it at these, southern part of their range? Like, how much of a swing in temperature is it between winter and summer?
Yeah, so that is quite interesting, because there's a very big difference between summer and winter. The dry sort of winter season and the wet summer season, and that also sort of influence the ecology of the species. So what we do see a seasonal shift in where the crocodiles are in the different times of the year. But in summer, I'm not sure in terms of Fahrenheit, but in terms of Celsius, it really, we have warm summer seasons, but in the winter, it gets actually really cold. One interesting thing maybe in terms of that, we've captured crocodiles throughout the winter. So being opportunistic predators, crocodiles will always go into traps, even though it's cool. But the season is very different within the winter, and we suspect that they don't naturally eat a lot within the winter season when it's a lot cooler. Now, when I talk about cool winter, I'm not talking about like North Carolina, where you have alligators, in really, really cold temperatures. So it's not like that at all. In St. Lucia, it don't really, in terms of ambient temperature, it doesn't really get colder than maybe 5 or 6 or 7 degrees Celsius, but it's still very different to the much warmer summer climate. Yeah, when they are a lot more active, and obviously feeding and breeding and nesting in the summer season.
Yeah, the reason I brought that up is because one of my crocodilian mentors, he lives in Southeast Texas, and he has a large collection of Nile crocs. And most winters, he's able to keep them outdoors year-round perfectly fine, whereas a lot of the more tropical species, he has to pull indoors for the winter. So,
right.
They're not an American alligator or a Chinese alligator, but they're still a lot more cold tolerant than, say, a salty.
Yeah. And I think maybe, the crocodiles in South Africa perhaps even more so than some of the more sort of tropical crocodiles in Kenya and Tanzania. So yeah, no, they definitely are adapted, with the cooler weather down in the south. Yeah.
So I had Mark Merchant on. He was talking about his research with alligator coloration, how in the more northern, cooler parts of the climate, alligators are a lot darker colored than in the southern, warmer portions. So are Nile crocs in South Africa noticeably darker colored than more tropical populations?
To my knowledge, there has not any research been done. Just anecdotally, what we've seen is that individuals within Cozy Bay, where there's a lot of forests where they occur, they tend to be darker in color. But yeah, that's just sort of anecdotal evidence. It's never been sort of, we've never done a study in terms of that. So what we do find is you do get sort of your more yellow crocodiles, as well as the more sort of, green, brown, darker individuals intermixed within these populations. So yeah, there's been, to my knowledge, no study ever been done, and I don't think there's a very definite, sort of coloration difference that I'm aware of.
All right. Let's see. So you also did work. You also were a co-author on the paper about the ecological importance of crocodilians and sort of towards an evidence-based justification for their conservation, which is a. I mean, it's nice to say, conserve something for the sake of conserving it, but I always find it really important to provide another hands-on reason why something should be conserved. So.
Yeah, I mean, in South Africa, I mean, the big thing here is that I think one of the main reasons why we are losing a lot of our crocodiles is because of because there's no link in terms of sustainable use. So, I mean, same thing in the States and in Australia, you've got that clear link. A lot of the farms ranch their eggs from free roaming populations. In South Africa, we only have closed circuit crocodile farming. So that's good in itself, because it does take away pressure from the wild populations. But the problem with that is that you lose that link between the wild populations and that real conservation value of the species. So one of the things that we would like to do is to try and encourage ranching programs where we, sort of allow local people that live with crocodiles to become beneficiaries of their conservation. So that it really is one of our key things to look at for the future. How can we reestablish the value within the species? Because in Southern Africa or in Africa, it's really a conservation value. It's not just protecting species, but it's trying to conserve them because of the real benefit that they can bring to people and livelihoods.
Yeah. So, I mean, one possible way they're kind of important is, well, they're an apex predator, so they're all automatically a keystone species. But tying back into your previous research with lead and heavy metals and DDT, I'm guessing they'll also be a good bioindicator of toxin buildup in an environment.
Yeah, I mean they are. I mean they're a great study organism because of the fact that they are long-lived, and they are apex predators. So they're really great, specifically in terms of organopesticides that bioaccumulate. Lead, same thing. So generally, if you have declining crocodile populations, never mind the sort of the biological side to it, it often tells you that there's something wrong in the system, that there's mismanagement, and unfortunately, in South Africa, we have great legislation for water quality and but we're sitting with some of the most polluted rivers in Southern Africa. And a number of years ago, I think it was in 2008, there was a mortality event in Kruger National Park, which is one of our largest, wildlife areas, where possibly up to 400 adult crocodiles died from a disease called pansteatitis. So that was a big red flag that went up, because here you have a national park, and you have 400 crocodiles dead within the space of a few months, and it's just a sign that that there's a big issue within the system and within the catchment and in the management of the catchment. So that is very frustrating that conservation agencies needs to deal with these sort of issues like pollution and contaminants way down the catchment level, and where they don't often have any control in terms of legislation and specifically enforcement of legislation. Because, as I've mentioned, we got great legislation in this country, but unfortunately, it really is not effective, and we're sitting with huge problems in terms of water quality and eutrophication and river flow, within our river system. So it's a big concern.
Yeah. So one thing, especially with crocodilians, all large predators, is with their conservation is the difficulty in with their conflicts with human populations, whether it be like competing for food sources or unfortunately lethal attacks on humans. So what's kind of the scale slash form of human crocodile conflict in South Africa?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have human croc conflict in all the provinces. So we got crocodiles in 4 provinces within South Africa. Um, and thankfully, it is not near the level of countries like Mozambique and Zimbabwe, Kenya, maybe even Namibia. But yeah, so on average, there is easily 4 or 5 or 6 attacks that we know of within South Africa. And of all the provinces, KwaZulu-Natal is, the province where most of these attacks occur, because a lot of people live, with crocodiles. They interact daily within the same water bodies. As I've mentioned before, they fish. So there is human croc conflict. I think 3 weeks ago, a wilderness trails officer was attacked by a crocodile within Kruger National Park. Thankfully, he survived it, but it happens. But it isn't near the level, thankfully, of the countries north of South Africa.
Yeah, and it's just something anecdotally that I've noticed is the countries with the highest amount of modern plumbing have lower amounts of crocodilian attacks. Just what it seems like to me.
Yeah. Right.
So toilets are really important. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we have one thing which is true for almost all of our protected areas is that it is surrounded by a lot of poor people, people that's reliant on resources from the water, that's reliant on water, and therefore, human croc conflict is just it's very much a reality, not only in South Africa but also north of South Africa, where the extent, I think, is a lot greater. But yeah, people do come in conflict with crocodiles, maybe a lot more than in countries like the United States or Australia.
yeah. Uh, so besides Nile crocs, are there any other species you do research with?
No. So on what there is Mekistop cataphractus do occur in Zambia. So there's a student working with Dr. Matt Shirley in that population. But yeah, I'm not directly involved with any other species at this stage. Yeah.
Yeah. So ecologically, with Nile crocs, you mentioned fish, but in particular, what it sort of makes up the bulk of their diet?
Yeah, I mean, like, so in terms of Nile crocs, I think fish, in terms of the studies that we've done, John, I've mentioned Dr. John Warner. He's done a stable isotope study, and it seems like fish is definitely the most prevalent food item for crocs. But there's a particular interesting case in the Olifants River where we did a study a couple of years ago. Also, it was a stable isotope study. I was just a co-author on that study, and we actually found that the majority of the prey items in that system was from the terrestrial side. So not fish, but terrestrial prey. So that was kind of interesting. But generally, fish, especially in places like the St. Lucia estuarine system, they fish definitely is the predominant prey item for crocodiles. Yeah. So as they grow, of course, they change a bit, and the larger crocodiles definitely also take larger mammals like antelope, wildebeest, buffalo, etc. But definitely fish seems to be, but they're opportunistic. I mean, and we've seen large crocodiles at night still, going for small fish even. So it's not just the big crocs that goes for the big, big prey items. They very opportunistic. Yeah,
Calories are calories, no matter how big the package is.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, so in terms of predation, I mean, obviously, young juvenile crocs are on the menu for just about anything and everything around the water. But older adult crocs, do they have any natural predators outside of man or another bigger croc?
Yeah, yeah. So not really. Yeah. So I mean, John Hutton described that ecological separation. So what we also see in South Africa is that your juvenile crocs, the first couple of years, they tend to hang around within wetland areas, and you don't really see them going into interacting with larger crocodiles, basking on sandbanks, etc. But when they do get bigger, they then will join some of the other crocs. But I've seen even like 2 meter crocodiles fall prey to other larger crocs. So they definitely regulate their own populations without a doubt. But yeah, apart from man, once they sort of over a meter or so, there's hardly any predators that actually pose a threat to them. When they're really small, a lot of things eat crocs. I mean, big fish, herons, fish eagles, so monitor lizards. So there's a lot of other animals that will feed on baby crocs, young crocs, hatchlings or yearlings, even 2 or 3 year old crocodiles. But later on, it's only other crocs, and then of course people, unfortunately.
Yeah. So now crocs are often considered to be one of the most social, I guess is the best word to describe it, of all the crocs. So how here, how complex do you say their social structure is compared to other crocodilians?
Yeah, so I mean, we definitely see huge congregations, specifically in wintertime. So I was involved for many, many years just counting crocodiles from the air. So what we would typically do in our winter season is do these aerial surveys in populations like St. Lucia and other populations. And that's really true for most of the larger populations in South Africa, is that at least once a year, those large populations are surveyed from the air. And we do see these massive congregations in wintertime. So, they are very much social, I think a lot more so than, for instance, the saltwater crocodiles. And we think the social side in winter has a lot to do with reproduction. So that's where most of the mating occur. And then after winter, going into spring, those congregations then break down as those females will then move to nesting areas, and the males will also return to other parts of the system. So there is a definite shift within populations where they congregate in winter, and you have literally 3, 4, 500 crocodiles within a few kilometers, which is quite nice to see. But yeah, so that is interesting, and there's not a lot of research that I'm aware of in terms of the social side. Tony Pooley, which was sort of one of the pioneers and researchers in South Africa. Just give me 1 second, mate.
Yep.
Sorry, I just want to switch this softer.
Yeah.
He did quite a bit of work on the social side, but most of his work was conducted within the St. Lucia Crocodile Center. So where he did a lot of observational work, as well as some work within the system. So he published quite a bit of that in terms of female behavior with hatchlings and that type of thing. But yeah, that is, the social side is quite interesting, but we don't fully understand, the complexities around that as well as we should maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned that females in general go off to more of nesting locations, whereas males go to slightly different parts of the area. Is that like a
Yeah.
solid,
Yeah.
noticeable behavior?
Yeah. So I mean, the what we found in St. Lucia, and also interestingly so, I'm involved in a study in Tanzania where we have some crocodiles with satellite transmitters on. And again, there's a definite shift between the cooler and the wet season. So it seems like Nile crocs do utilize different parts of the system, during different times of the year. So these females would literally go to a specific place where there's huge congregations, and then from there they would move often 15, 20, 30, 40 kilometers to other parts where they would then construct their nests within particular nesting areas. And those nesting areas are reused, as I've mentioned before, year after year, within the constraints of fresh water, because we always see that they do need fresh water near where they are nesting. So, for instance, in St. Lucia, when it's really dry in the north, there is a shift of nesting activities more towards the southern section of the system, where there's constant water supply, fresh water supply. So, and then the males, yeah, they would go back to their own home ranges where there's obviously females. But yeah, so there's this definite congregation within the winter, and then a movement into other parts of the system for the rest of the year.
Yeah. So I'm guessing these congregation sites are more like the deeper water bodies, deeper reservoirs within the water system.
Yeah. So that tend to be close to deeper water. I mean, obviously for mating activities, they do need deeper water. It's always near water bodies, and then nice basking areas. So typically open sandy areas where they can bask, and at night go into the water again, because especially in winter, the ambient temperatures can get really cold. So crocodiles tend to then be in the water at night, and even select deeper areas within the water body where they would then frequent the night, spend the night.
Yeah. Um, we covered quite a bit. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
Well, yeah, just the main thing is just our concern, in South Africa in terms of the declining populations. The other thing maybe is also we're having a crocodile monitoring network meeting in a couple of months, where we're going to try and get the provinces to work closer together, because one of the challenges in South Africa is that we have these 4 provinces with Nile crocodiles, but there's really no linkages. There's no sort of collaboration at the provincial conservation agency level. So provinces do supply monitoring numbers for CITES, but one of our biggest challenges is to try and get these provinces to work together better, and also work towards developing a Nile crocodile biodiversity management plan, because we have management plans for species like lion, wild dog, rhino, but we don't have a sort of a national biodiversity plan for Nile crocodile. So that's kind of one of the things that we need to do. And the IUCN Crocodile Specialist Group is we're very active within South Africa, and that is one way that we do collaborate. But they definitely at the national government level and at the provincial level, there is a big need to try and work sort of closer together. So that's one of our challenges.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Nate. Thanks for having me. It's been great chatting to you, and great podcast. Thanks for your efforts.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Right, man. Take care, hey?
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.